Yes, this is Johnny Reviews. As always, greetings, friends, my loyal GeoCells. It is December. It is a week before Christmas, before my birthday, before I turn 30 years old, and I realized that, this is the time where you really start to look at your life. I was just on Millennial, so that was pretty good. But this is the fourth and final. Wait, fourth or fifth? I believe it's the fourth chapter. Yes, it is the fourth chapter. The fourth and final installment. No, actually, it's the fifth chapter. I'm very sorry. It's the fifth chapter. Fifth chapter of Byung Han's Infocracy. And next week, I will start with. Oh God, that's gonna be a slog. I'm probably gonna have to not do like reading it paragraph by paragraph. I'm probably going to have to skip a lot, because Mbebe does ramble somewhat. Next week will be the first installment of Necropolitics. Hopefully, from there, I can wrap it up to where I can do John David Ebert's Art After Metaphysics, which is a book I long wanted to review. And then maybe I will start to think about doing the Red Book by Carl Jung. But that's going to take a lot. And I don't know if I could like grift as a course. I would have to I need to find a way to incentivize people to go to my Patreon. But anyways, lots of happenings, as always, big content around this time. Many people want to push their stuff out, before Christmas and New Year's and so forth. A lot of streams, But anyways, this is very interesting times we're living in. And I think that, it's funny because I anticipated more of a discussion on art and aesthetics with Millennial Woes. But we ended up just talking about a lot of the stuff that I talk about here during this series. And of course, with, Byung Han's work in general. We ended up talking about, we took a little bit of a trip down memory lane, talking about 2016, and I mentioned the essay within the Infocracy about digital rationality. So it'll be up on if you go to my Linktree. Apparently, Twitter, you can't link to Linktree anymore, but I'm sure Musk will have to reverse that decision. I think he's just doing it to troll people, hopefully. I think you could still link to Patreon, and YouTube, but you can't link to Instagram, Facebook, or any aggregator Linktree. I don't even think I would want to risk Find My Friends, which I should chill. But Linktree is convenient because it is an automatic. If you want to send me a PayPal.me. By the way, last minute shilling before I go on. I have a Buy Me a Coffee and I have a PayPal.me. So if you want to donate just one off, I'm thinking of putting all of my paid walled content on Substack as well. So you could pay $5 or whatever a month. $5 a month. Because if I'm charging you $5 on Patreon, then I can charge you on Substack, right? So I know Prudentialist does that. So I'm gearing up for that. Okay, in the new year. And I just haven't found the time to put stock on my website. I do have a website, which I will probably come out with, after New Year's. I already have it. It's just, I have to test it, and it's essentially just a Square app website. So, yeah. But it's just me not being lazy. That'll take a whole thing. So, anyways, this is the final chapter of Infocracy, and before that, so again, last minute shilling. This will be, the first half will always be free. That so. But the spicier stuff is always on Patreon. So patreon.com/productions. Yeah, that's it. I'm done with shilling. I wanted to talk about the nature of truth because this chapter is called The Crisis of Truth. In the absence of truth. Now, in the absence of truth, I think even more than Panopticon because I listen to it more. In the Absence of Truth is my favorite ISIS album, more or less. Because I listen to it all the time. I listen to especially songs like Dochania, songs like Over Root and Thorn. My favorite song, I think, besides the Alberine one, it's called Not in Rivers But in Drops. That's what it's called. And in the absence of truth is the reason I'm talking about this is because I wanted to explain a reference I made in my No Amnesty article that I'm sure every one of you has probably read. And it's funny because that one, again, I said last moment of shilling, but that article, a part of it will be featured with artwork in Man's World magazine. I forget which issue, coming out in January. So very excited for that one. Raw Egg always edits my stuff pretty good in terms of the images and everything. And I also have, I think I have 2 drawings I never quite released, or one of them I never quite released. So anyways, in the absence of truth has to do with the paradox of belief. And it's a concept album, but it's not a concept album in the way that it's different stories that relate around the theme of fantasy becoming reality. And it's not a concept album in the way that Panopticon is, where Panopticon very much is like this Foucauldian album. Wavering Radiant is also, I believe, heavily inspired by the works of Jung. That was like the last ISIS album before Aaron Turner decided to call it quits. But he does other things. He does a lot of different side projects. Like, I think he also does music with his wife, who is also a musician. But in the absence of truth, it is a really great album because it shows the malleability of truth. I believe there was a song about this book he read that came out in, I believe, 2000, where it's about this family that discovers kind of like a Bodhasian infinite library. Of course, it makes references to the actual Bodhas Bodhas short story, Borsius, but Bodhas, right? The short story called Zaire, where the Zaire is sort of like an implement of manifestation that turns you into any object of affect into an obsession that you cannot forget about, you always see. I believe that's the basis of the story. Or some mystic, Sufi mystic imparts this vision of the Zaire upon you. Of course, it's in reference to Don Quixote. Like Dulcinea is, Dulcinea is a song ostensibly about the vision becoming realer than reality. Don Quixote envisions Dulcinea. She's the most beautiful woman because she's the most simple, but it's through his imagination. And people think he's crazy, but really he's not crazy. Dulcinea in a way is a metaphor for the pure muse, right? But that belief carries you into a reality that is much more befuddling and murky and quixotic, obviously, than some sort of typical common romance story. But another reference that's made is to the Islamic mystic assassins cult run by what's his name? Al-Sabah, right? And I made this reference in my piece because that was really of the sort of biosecurity theater of the last 2 years. It really showed, especially the fact that everyone was reduced to being online, it really did show the sort of malleability to the sort of reality that we're living in. And it shows that, in this world, and again, so the quote that Hassan al-Sabah came up with, which people think, attributes to his character in the Assassin's Creed video game. But really, he came up with a version of it, and people falsely attribute it to Nietzsche. But I believe Nietzsche, he had some knowledge of it. So I'll read you some bits before I go into Infocracy, the last chapter. But essentially, his quote was, and again, it's very hard to translate. Nothing is real, everything's permitted. Meaning that, in this world, nothing is real, everything is permitted. Meaning that in this world, lacking the sort of, a lot of the Islamic mystics that dabbled with Neoplatonism. And a lot of people have criticisms of Neoplatonism. But that is supposed to denote the sort of non-attachment to what this world provides. So let me read. So I'm not going to read all of this, but this is an article called, Redactors, M-worders, for a False Paradise, the Hashinis. It's hard to pronounce. Hashanis. Yeah, Hashashanis. There you go. Hashashanis. So he was a warrior mystic. Apparently they fought off the Suljaks, right? His sort of cult of assassins, and they had this ritual that they would initiate into to basically simulate what the afterlife is in mystical Islam. So these talks about the Suljak Empire. Omar Khayyam was also around here, renowned wiseman and poet, and Hassan al-Sabah, founder of the Assassins, which spread worldwide terror. Although the age difference between the three layers, this account opened to controversy. Nassim al-Mulk asked Hassan al-Sabah to become his governor when he was assigned as Grand Vizier. However, Sabah had set sights on al-Mulk's position. He requested a position in the palace. So the palace is at Armagh, and that becomes very important. So moving on, as time went on, he followed the doctrine of Batinaya, so adopted by the Fatimid Empire. Batin refers to the inner meaning of the Quran. It adopts the belief that the Quran has both the hidden and apparent meaning. The Batinaya school, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, Batinaya school of thought alleges that people can acquire truth only from an infallible imam. Furthermore, it adopts the concept of reincarnation and the belief that both heaven and hell exist in the material world. So again, I believe, don't quote me on it. Again, I'm not an expert in Islamic theology. But I'm sure from the view of Wahhabism, this is kind of like heretical, right? This is haram. So the followers of this set doctrine did not refrain from any harams, Islamically prohibited practices. So there you go. It's a pretty heretical, yeah. The Batinaya also refers to it as Ismailis, recognized as one of the great imams, Ismail, the grandson of Ali, who was both the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. Then it talks about, its relationship to the philosophies of, Zoroastrianism, Kabbalah, Pythagoreanism, Philomonism. There are some historians who claim that such religious sects that were unable to destroy Islam by the sword attempted to impose internal pressures. And so again, maybe Batinaya was sort of like a mystical psyop, if you will. Hassan al-Sabah gathered many supporters at first. Malik Shah, emperor of the Suljak Empire, wrote a warning letter to Sabah, and then it talks about their conquest. So then he writes, and this is the important part right here. Sabah did not leave the letter unanswered. He occupied a few fortresses, including the Alamat Castle. Sabah believed that the reality behind all existence could be acquired through abiding by the rules of the Imam. Therefore, learning the science was prohibited. Sciences was prohibited. Base check, based alert, base department. Not learning science. The closer one is, quote, the closer one is to the Zaire, the world of form. And again, you pretty much know where Borjas got that title from, because of course they all these writers went to Tangiers in Tunisia, or they went to Morocco, and so they learned about Sufism and so forth. And I think some of them actually went to Turkey. The closer one is to the Zaire world of forms, the less one can understand the batin, hidden meaning, batin. Their main principle was to eliminate all people against the Batinaya. Sabah was told to drug his soldiers with hashish, leading them to paradise because it causes them to hallucinate, assigning redacting orders as a religious task. Sabah's soldiers were used as assassins. This group of assassins was named the Hashashians. Sorry, it's hard to pronounce. In European language, the term assassin used to describe a murderer originating from Sabah's military force. Then it talks about how they were so prolific that the Suljaks were even afraid of them. He described as a fair, religious, critical, and long-suffering man. He redacted his two sons because one of them drank wine and the other was a redactor. His most powerful weapon was loyalty and discipline. And the Garden of Paradise, and again, this is important, and this is what has to do with the ISIS song. Sabah's principal objective was not forced on religion, but rather to destroy political and social structure. In the light of the fact that his supporters were fully motivated, the Hashashanins were a long-lasting military group. Besides the Garden of Paradise, which were built in Alamat, is one of an imaginary account of historians or travelers, such as Marco Polo, who never visited the place. So it becomes mythology, essentially, this garden. And it's basically the Iranian, Persian garden to simulate heavenly paradise. where there would be virgins that would feed you hashish, and they would simulate you, dying and going into the afterlife and having a vision of, Allah. And of course, there's also rumors that when he died, the Batanaya persisted in Sicily, of all places, and formed the first structures of the mafia. Various European soldiers are interested in the history of Hassan al-Sabah and Hashashanis. They're subject of many novels and movies, of course, Assassin's Creed. And this is another academic paper that talks about Batanaya. So what is meant by, this is by the scholar Jeff Taylor, what is meant by nothing is real, all is permitted. Quotes by the passage minutes to go, then claims, quoted, Bethul does quote Hassan's last words in her book, but they're not the exact words. Nothing is true, everything permitted is the chapter 13 of her book. The suggestion that it was his last words comes from the fact that the line itself is a cut up from his book. So he said some iteration of it. Goodbye, he said, and remembering my spirit watches, as long as you are worthy of it, worthy of understanding it, will counsel you. So then it talks about how the true meaning of it is sort of like the nature of truth in this world. Then it goes into a lot of academic ease. Nothing's true, everything prevented very well. That was the freedom of spirit. So this is actually a quote by Nietzsche. So in the genealogy of morals, when the Christian crusaders in the Orient encountered the invincible order of the assassins, that order of free spirits par excellence, whose lowest rank follows a rule of obedience and like that of which no order of monks ever attained. Well, again, this is Nietzsche being very, critical of Christianity. I would differ from his analysis, but anyways. They obtained in some way or other a hint concerning that symbol and watchword reserved for the highest ranks alone of the secretium, or secret, magisterium. Nothing is true, everything's permitted. Very well, that was freedom of spirit. In the way that faith in truth itself was abrogated, has any European, any Christian free spirit ever strayed into this position and into its labyrinthine consequences? Has one of them ever known the minotaur of this cave from experience? Then he goes on, this is Kaufman's notes, but of course, a lot of right-wingers that read Nietzsche heavily criticize Kaufman for turning him into a lib. The assassin slogan is often mistaken for Nietzsche's coinage and derived from Dostoevsky by Danto. So, Arthur Danto or another Danto? Yeah. It must surely be a paraphrase of the Russian novelist he so admired. In Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, we encounter the idea that if mankind lost the belief in God and immortality, everything would be permitted. But what matters to Nietzsche in this section is the first half of the quotation, nothing is true, which is no parallel to Dostoevsky. Incidentally, Nietzsche never read the Brothers Karamazov. I didn't know that, Karamazov. I never knew that. I never read Dostoevsky. So I guess Jordan Peterson BTFO'd. But no, I think it's very interesting because when you really examine that phrase, you have to realize that it's coming from a place of, immense mystical and metaphysical weight within the more esoteric elements of, albeit heretical, but mystical Islam. So when Hassan al-Sabah says nothing is true, everything's permitted, it's in the Zaire, it's in the exoteric, it's in this worldliness where nothing is true, everything's permitted. But the reality of the Batan, right? I know I'm butchering the pronunciation. That is real. And I think that when it comes to an album like In the Absence of Truth, that's also the message. And I think that, we will see in this chapter that Byung is saying something, he's echoing Nietzsche, in the sense that given the digital world, we have the capacity to see that, nothing is true, everything's permitted. I mean, yes, there are Jannies. Yes, there's censorship. Yes, there are, ideas and thoughts that you cannot touch. But as a whole, the way that the online world has manifested itself, there is more or less a malleability to what is true. It is the full realization of Nietzschean perspectivalism. But when Nietzsche talks about the last man, and we're living in that age of the last man, the bug man, the soy jack, you name it, right? Like whatever, like right-wing minutia you want to used to like describe this world we're living in. The mass individual, the NPC, like you name it. It all denotes the sort of same phenomenon, right? The sort of agency-less, consumer, secular, thoroughly secular, no belief in any higher values, not wishing to strive for any higher values in life. And I think that, or Longhouse, there you go, Longhouse, that's the Bappian coinage. But the point being is that, well, that's interesting about Bap. I had another point about that, he talked about that soup from Colombia, that Anthony Bourdain, he was with these cholos, and what was it called? El cocho, and he's like, we have this soup. He's like, well, every peasant slop. And Bap is I think Bap at the end of that clip, it was in Western Bestern's Twitter account. He said that basically like these people, that they're like they're like the genetic refuse of like the soldiers that every empire has built to become like worker bee like robots, like that the Mayans bred specific. And it's so funny like to see like humanity as like biological stock, as like pure in framing, and how that and I remember like as terrible as that idea is, that like whole populations, he's like, are we just not is that what it is nowadays, just the unmitigated population growth of these every empire created these like soldier population, like these worker bee populations. And it's like, funny to see things in like a biological and framing, because that's basically what you could almost do like an Agamben move to Heidegger, the way that he, Agamben did to Foucault, where you could say that in framing is much older than we think. In framing, empires have always subjugated and like bred a certain population to have certain characteristics to basically become worker bees of the empire. The very second episode of Caribbean Rhythms, Bap talks about the Angolans and what the Portuguese did to Angola, was essentially creating like a mixed, serf managerial class. And they didn't believe in the sort of like purity of like the British, where the British would colonize you, but they would, take their families with them. They wouldn't really totally mix with the populations. But, us Mediterraneans, of course, that's all we did, So, but anyways, that's an off point. The point being is that, how did I get on that point about Bap? Oh, yeah, the Longhouse. These Longhouse populations. The point being is that, the truth, whatever metaphor you use to vivisect the condition of modern man as being one with little agency, but also the lacking of any capacity for greatness, or a project that really fostered our civilization going forward. This is acutely felt within hyperreality, within the internet age. You can sort of feel not just feel what it's like to be a last man. I truly believe that, great things will come out of the internet, and terrible things will, like Ayala tweets, but anyways, moving on. She blocked me, finally, thank God. The only e-girl I'll never simp for. But I think that, when reading this final chapter, I wanted to bring up the whole point about the Bataya and about Hassan al-Sabbah's quote, because it really plays to the theme of what Byung Chul is getting at. Is that, we do live in times, we live in the full realization of that perspectivalism, where truth becomes this very malleable, perspective-driven thing. Not just subjective, not just relativism, because truth still has bearing. It's, it's not total solipsistic relativism, of course. That's an impossibility. But it's the way that we approach it that becomes something else. It's the way that we dwell within our own reality tunnels, with our own, like, sort of guerrilla ontologies, if you look up the Robert Anton Wilson reference. That, the reality tunnels, the guerrilla ontology, the undermining of the ontological picture that most people have. And the E-Right is doing this. That's like a stated mission. Many other groups are doing this. This is an older idea. There's like that church that was obsessed with Francis E. Deck, that mock church. What was it called? What was it called? Something. The Genius Church. The one. Church of the Subgenius. Yeah, like they were like doing this. Like there were weirdos that read Robert Anton Wilson, and they were just sort of trying to find ways to undermine the picture of reality that people had. And Francis Deck was sort of like that. Like, this is very much like schizo culture and schizo autopoetics. Deleuze talked about this. And I think that the internet brings forth all of these different ideas that in a way is a sort of vicious takedown and assault of a very solidified picture of what the truth is. This is why people like, Jordan Peterson, this is why he freaks out. He's like, oh, you're undermining the truth. And it's, well, what is the truth when you really think about it? And that the nature of the online world brings to the forefront these issues around how we even intuit what is quote unquote the truth. But let's get into it. So here we go. This is the final chapter of Infocracy, The Crisis of Truth. That's a really great, that could be an album title, The Crisis of Truth. In the absence of truth is a really great title, but here we go. I hope you enjoy the music break from Philip Daniel. I keep forgetting to put the link down below, but I will this time. I will. I want to give him a promotion. So, and plus he lets me use his music. But anyways, in the future, I have a few people I know that could do it, but yeah. Anyways, so this is The Crisis of Truth. A new nihilism is spreading. This nihilism is not a result of religious articles of faith or traditional values losing their validity. That nihilism values, and he puts that in italics, that nihilism values, which Nietzsche expressed when he said God is dead or spoke of a transvaluation of all values, we had already left behind. The new nihilism is a phenomenon of the 21st century. And again, so just to comment, essentially, Byung Chul is doing something monumental here. He's declaring a sort of, kind of like Seraphim Rose a little bit, in that he's stating that this is the ground of a new nihilism. The 20th century, the age of anxiety, the death of God, or rather, we all know Nietzsche didn't mean, the literal death of God, although I think he, pretty much maintained his atheism till he went bonkers, right, till he died. He meant sort of the meta subtext of society no longer believing in God the same way. And I hate to say it, but even among trad Caths and trad orthos or Hindus or Muslims or whatever, it is true. Do you believe the same that your ancestors believed in? You believe in the same God, but do you believe in the same way, in the same assurance, in the same intensity? There's always that anxiety of doubt in the back of your mind. That's the whole point. But Byung Chul is doing something quite revolutionary, the way that he overturned Foucault. Now he's overturning Nietzsche. Not overturning Nietzsche, but he's saying that the new anxiety is something that is present within the 21st century, present within the digital reality that we're living in. So, that is a phenomenon of the 21st century. The new nihilism is a phenomenon of the 21st century, not the 20th century. This nihilism emerges when we lose faith in truth itself. Again, the post-truth thing. In the age of fake news, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, we're losing our sense of reality and its factual truths. The circulation of information is completely decoupled from reality. It takes place in a hyper-real space. The belief in facticity is lost. Will we therefore live in a defactized universe? Ultimately, the loss of the factual truth means the loss of a shared world and a framework for our actions. Again, because this is the basis of power knowledge, right? If to know what is true is to have a collective agreement and consensus on that truth. To know what is true means that you have a mutual agreed upon ontological basis for things like a society, like the sort of reality that holds together culture and custom and belief and identity, but also like even just basic common mundane things. Like, what is the truth of politics? What is the truth of the consensus around certain, issues of what even approaches a politics within a society? Like, what is worth debating over? What are the resources? Who gets what? And to what degree and to what measure? Like, these are classic Archimedean points of every politics, grounded within a civilization. So, to know what's true, I mean, that's like, step one. This is like right back to the Cartesian equation of what do we know is true, right? I think therefore am, blah, 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 which in some ways has been overturned by, post-metaphysical Western thought, like in phenomenology, like in Heidegger, right? Like, even that saying, I think therefore I am, even that is called into question, the sort of thrownness of the world. And I think Byung will talk about thrownness as well. So, but that's the whole point. If we don't know what's true, we pretty much can't know anything else. So, despite its radical nature, Nietzsche's critique of truth does not aim at the destruction of truth. It does not deny truth itself. It only uncovers its moral origins. Truth is deconstructed, that is genealogically reconstructed. According to Nietzsche, truth is a social construct that serves the purpose of facilitating human communicative life, or communal life. It provides communal life with an existential foundation. Quote, the drive from truth begins with a keen observation. So this is your second Nietzsche quote in this episode. The drive for truth begins with the keen observation of the opposition between the real world and the world of lies, and how all human existence becomes uncertain if conventional truth is not unconditionally binding. It is moral conviction about the necessity of a rigid convention if any human society is supposed to exist. If the state of war is ever to cease, then it must begin with the fixing of truth, that is, with a valid and binding signification of things. The liar uses words to make the unreal appear real. That is, he misuses the firm foundation. This is sophistry, to make lies appear true. The conception of truth, the concept of truth, ensures the different validity claims do not lead to a bellum omnitum contra omnes, to the complete fracturing of society. It is necessary convention that holds society and the social together. Today, Nietzsche's critique of society would be even more radical. He would describe our total loss of the drive for truth, the will to truth. Well, there is will to power, but that's, that's something different. The drive for truth develops only in a society that is unbroken. The disappearance of the drive for truth and the disintegration of society causes each other. When a society disintegrates into groups or tribes between which no understanding is possible, which shares no sense of the binding signification of things, the crisis of truth spreads in the crisis of truth. In the crisis, the shared world, even the shared language, is lost. Truth regulates social life, is a regulative idea of society. The new nihilism is a symptom of the information society. Truth contains a contrapedal force that holds a society together, but information contains a centrifugal force that destroys social cohesion. The new nihilism emerges within the social the same destructive process that leads to the crisis of democracy, the disintegration of discourse into information. Again, this is the whole point, that sort of communicative rationality gives way to digital rationality, that the truth is lost. The truth is something that is upended because of information. Because when you're bombarded with a constant change of perspective and viewpoints and, useless information in some ways, that really just muddles everything, then you really can't determine what is true. Most people can't. Most people, I hate to say it, do not have that analytical ability. I mean, this is just fact. Now here, Byung makes an important distinction, and you'll see what he means. He's not lamenting a sort of, let's call it middling IQ form of relativism, where truth is just subjective and it doesn't mean anything, and your truth and this truth. There still is truth. That's what people get wrong with Nietzschean perspectivalism. It's not purely relativistic. It's more that you can live in a certain way with embodying a truth that you hold dear, contrary to the truths of others. There is a consensus on, bigger material things. When the sky is blue, the sky is blue. The sky isn't purple. Maybe certain times at dawn or dusk or whatever, but you know what I mean. It's not neon purple or whatever. Well, it can be neon purple, I guess, at certain angles and so forth. But you get my point. It's more of just an attitudinal disposition towards life in advanced civilization that, happens to be crumbling, is that it tends towards the rulership of abstractions. And those abstractions, even though the sort of moralism that goes into terminal, 21st century hyperreality, that those things are closing in on us. There are very few things that you're allowed to believe anymore. But apart from that, when it comes to other things, when it comes to the majority of how you live your life, your disposition towards life, those things are always up for debate. And those things are the ones where you are given the seeming infinity of choice. Now, it's funny because the perception of choice is there, but the reality of choice is not, because choice requires agency. Now, I don't need to be some kind of neo-rationalist. I don't need to go and read some less wrong to talk about agency and IQ and all that, but all this, right? Maybe you do. But frankly, these things like quantifying IQ and how high IQ leads to agency, yeah, that's a simple statement, but the way that these, neurodivergent rationalists and neo-rationalists, the way that they go into it and they try to quantify it, this is all boring. This is boring. I don't care about it, That's like, that was BAP's subtweeting logo, by the way, when he's talking about, he's like, Thomas Picton or other, boring stuff I don't care about, I love when he said that. Anyways, yeah, he'll never let that go. I will never let my hatred of a certain thinker of ironies go. But anyways, it is funny. It's funny, the way he says it. My point being is that you can quantify it, but really boring stuff nobody cares about, right? But the simple statement that, having an IQ does lead to more agency. But why do we bring this up, right? Why do we bring this up when it comes to perspectivalism? I bring this up because you can be allowed to have your mental models of abstractions. You can even have certain behavioral abstractions, as we can, list all of the things that are condoned and approved of and celebrated that I can't, exactly, totally explicate on YouTube, if you know what I mean. But when it comes to the actual enacting of one's beliefs, in terms of it reflecting as a mirror onto the world, that requires a very high degree of agency that only very, rich people and people in positions of immense political power in the Western world, those are the people that have a high degree of agency. Now, you can have a high degree of agency as an autocrat in, the global South, right? You can do things that others can't. You have access to a lot of different programs and power that, normal people don't. But that's sort of like a fugitive elite that I think in the coming decades will probably be I know I'm just verging on geopolitics here, but I think in the coming decades, these people will have more of a say. I think that a certain war that's going on right now in a certain blue-yellow country is probably, it's, again, this is a romantic vision of certain people. One guy has a funny beard in, Moscow, but this is a romantic vision of certain thinkers, but I think that it's interesting how this war, I believe, is probably the global south saying maybe we've had enough. And that maybe whatever power is more likely to win this thing will have geopolitical implications going forward. There is a not uncertain chance. There's a totally likely, not at all absurd statement or chance in saying that the global south is viewing this as like, well, maybe we want more of that agency that is coveted, that the Western powers have, right? But not all Western powers have agency, have the degree of agency that America does. America, Britain, the Anglosphere. But anyways, those are all just geopolitics. I'm obviously not an expert, but the reason I bring this up is because agency is the linchpin of enacting one's beliefs. What are beliefs then that you can impose upon others, the grand other? Most people form their beliefs on a feedback loop with the other. In fact, all people. Very few people have the agency to enact their beliefs. However, when it comes to the internet age, there are cases in which smaller actors can create a tiny little fire that can travel through the digital oceans, like one of those well fires in oil spigs or whatever, or natural gas deposits in the middle of the ocean. I'm trying to paint a picture here of how fire can be in the ocean, right? Can create a huge well, can create a huge Exxon Valdez oil spill that turns into an inferno on the top of the ocean. This is, I think, the sort of terrifying power of the internet age that the sort of, let's call it, for lack of a better term, the regime, maybe didn't anticipate fully. And there are certain events that have happened that have led to it. Now, I don't mean, a lot of those have been influenced or have been consented to by rival elites. There's no such thing as a purely organic political movement or cultural movement. There's always elites that tacitly consent to it. And there's also the reality that a lot of these things are being manipulated and viewed as this sort of liberal myth of the grassroots organization that kindles a flame kindling into an inferno. This is the color revolutions of the 2000s. That was sold on, most people, as, oh, this is purely internet-based. Like in Tunisia, they tried one in Belarus, they tried one in Moscow. This is a fiction. Well, at least some people, even nowadays, it's happening in Iran. There are always organic elements to it, but those organic elements are boosted and magnified by a lot of these NGO networks and a lot of people on the outside. The point being is that this all has to do with the manufacturing of reality, of perspective reality, of a fluidity of reality. And the regime tries their best to enforce a narrative. But other people will go to it and they will say, no, that's not, our view of things. It's like there's people that are like, totally for the current thing. Then there's people that just are dead set against the current thing, right? And it seems within the last 5 years, we've seen this intensify, this nature of perspectival reality. But anyways, moving on. This is the point. The point being is that how do you, in a world of post-truth, more or less, enforce your view of reality, of truth? You have to have a degree of agency. And in the absence of real material agency, there is the reality of virtual agency that the online world, that hyperreality has provided us. So think of it that way. The frogs are the masters of this. The frogs especially. Most people listening to this. But when it comes to translating that the virtual nature of post-truth narrative, how do you translate that into material truth, narrative, power? Very difficult. That's the alchemical stone of all internet political movements. How do you translate that into the real world? But not just how do you translate that into the real world, but how do you have enough agency to influence enough of the population to translate that into meaningful political change? That's always the problem. The boomers of a certain variety, you know who I'm talking about, with that letter in front of them that I can't say on YouTube. I hate to say it, but they're probably beating, the millennials and the Zoomers at this, especially on the E-right. But, well, there's a reason for that. There's a whole variety of reasons why that is. Because, boomers do still have material political power as a generation. They have financial power as a generation. But that being said, the question of post-truth and agency is an interesting one. And in a world of quote-unquote post-truth, although I hate that term because it's been overplayed by journalists and think piece hacks that don't know what they're talking about, that don't know about the frogs, right? It's, anyways. I hate that term, but for the lack of a better term, post-truth. Agency is a huge part of it. But anyways, let's move on. I just want you to know that. I want you to keep that in mind. In a world of the fluidity of truth itself, how do you impose your truth on the other? Or how does a truth, a perspective, garner the agency to influence a material plane rather than a virtual plane or a cultural plane, right? Those sedimentary layers. It's like we're in the war. The online war is largely the war over meat space. But how do you chew up that meat space to influence, greater aspects of... It seems that, especially the last 5 years, meat space has just become fuel for the online world. But anyways, that's, there's a feedback loop going on. There's sort of an infolding of the outside in going on, We're moving on. The distinction between truth and... So this is a very good point. The new nihilism does not mean that lies are presented as truths or truths discredited as lies. Rather, the distinction between the truth and lie is undermined. Nothing is true. Everything's permitted in the absence of truth, right? Paradoxically, someone who intentionally lies and contradicts truth thereby acknowledges the truth. It is possible to lie only... This is a very Kantian distinction here, right? Everyone gives each other the moral law. If you don't have that, then, you can't exactly... you can't rob to the point where everyone robs, and robbing people, stealing, theft just becomes normal, right? You can't have a reality where everyone lies to the point where all lies become true. While in a way the internet has a way of doing that, but tautologically, that's not the truth, right? That's the basic Kantian, that's like first year philosophy. You can't lie to the point where everyone lies and everything becomes true. No, you have to, you're giving each other the moral law. So that's just like a reaffirmation. It's like pure relativism. It's like there's no universal principles, but that's also universal principles. So it's self-defeating, in other words. Paradoxically, someone who intentionally lies and contradicts truth thereby acknowledges the truth. It is possible to lie only if the distinction between truth and lie is still intact. A liar does not lose his relation to truth. His faith in reality is not shaken, paradoxically. A liar is not a nihilist. He does not question truth itself. He merely lies. The more determined the lie, the more validated the truth. He still believes in the truth. He's lying for whatever purpose, right? But it's when you start to believe your own lies. When, to quote, again, wrestling terminology, when you become a mark for yourself, right? Like, what did Jim Cornette say? They're self-marking. They took the marks out of the stands. They put them in the ring. They became marks for themselves. Is that a good Jim Cornette voice? Anyways. Fake news is not a series of lies. Fake news is an attack on the facts themselves. It defactizes reality. In asserting whether suits his purposes without compunction, Donald Trump is not a typical liar. Someone who intentionally distorts things. He is rather indifferent towards factual truths. Someone who is blind to facts and reality possesses a greater threat to truth than does a liar. Giga Chad, yes. Donald Trump, every time he said something, maybe not the Trump of this era, but he had a capacity to create truth ergogorically. He created a hyperstition. He would put something out there and it would just magically manifest as somewhat kind of true in the end. I hate to say it, but that's how ergogores work. That's hyperstitions, the blending of fiction and fiction and narrative and fact and reality. So, Trump himself was like a hyperstitional feedback loop, right? Superstition blending with narrative, blending with hyperreality. So moving on. The American philosopher Henry Frankfurt would call Trump a BSer. A BSer does not contradict the truth. He is completely indifferent to truth. So this is like psychopolitics, right? There was a chapter in that. Frankfurt's explanation for why there is so much BS today is, however, insufficient. Quote, BS is unavoidable, whether circumstances require someone to talk without knowing what he is talking about. Thus, the product of BS is stimulated whenever a person's obligations or opportunities to speak about some topic exceeds his knowledge of the facts that are relevant to the topic. Now, I do this sometimes. I sort of extrapolate the knowledge I already have into, something that I may not know exactly about, but I don't know. Well, you have to have a very sufficient IQ to be a BSer, So anyways, I'm kidding. So his knowledge is, inadequate, so he just makes it up, or rather he extrapolates from what he knows. Sort of like cold reading. It's sort of like what Orson Welles said about when he was a cold reader, and he pretended to be a psychic. And then there was this woman, he was renting an office, he was doing a movie. So he got bored, and his wife at the time rented an apartment that he put out an ad for in New York, where people would go to him for his psychic abilities, quote unquote. And then he remembers telling a woman about why her husband died and how he felt about her, and she broke down in tears, and it sounded so amazing that he closed the apartment. He finished up the movie. He never did that again, because then you start to believe in your own power. He said that's very scary. So, anyways. Closely related instances arise from the widespread convictions that it is the responsibility of a citizen in a democracy to have opinions about everything, or at least everything that pertains to the conduct of his country's affairs. Exactly. The internet does this to you, especially if you're a quote-unquote content creator. So you have to have a hot take on everything. You have to just do it. You have to it forces you to comment on every single issue. Rather, you should have the power to say no. That in itself is an incredible power. To say, I don't care about something. But few of us do that because we're trusted by our loyal fans and patrons to have an opinion on everything. And then it's meaningless after. It's totally meaningless. But anyways, moving on. If BS were the result of insufficient knowledge, Trump would not be a BSer. Henry Frankfurt, again, I'm saying BS because of, YouTube. Henry Frankfurt does not seem to grasp today's crisis of truth. This crisis cannot be explained in terms of discrepancy between knowledge and facts or a lack of knowledge of reality. The crisis of truth shakes belief in the facts themselves. Opinions can differ widely, but still can be legitimate as long as they respect factual truth. Freedom of opinion degrades into a farce, or denigrates into a farce. By contrast, if it loses all reference to facts and factual truth, it becomes a third-order simulation, right? It has no bearing on the real, on the original sign, right? But look at this line. This crisis cannot be explained in terms of discrepancy between knowledge and facts or lack of knowledge of reality. The crisis of truth shakes belief in the facts themselves. Right? So it's not that you are extrapolating on something that you don't know based on previous nodes of knowledge and truth and what you think you know. And you can, I hate this term, guesstimate, but you can guesstimate it, right? But it's rather the facts themselves are up for debate. The facts themselves are not easily attainable. They're lost in a sea of information. What was the previous 2 years? The global pandemic, right? That itself was the endless sea of information that you could not grasp because the facts themselves were not just debated over, but there were contrary facts. There were contrary narratives that used just as convincingly sounding arguments as not, right? When you have two rival facts haggling over a truth, what do? It's not this issue of I don't know something fully, but I know something that can approximate these other things, right? You can extrapolate. You can sort of, kind of, it's kind of like when you don't know the name of a wrestling move. And it's I know what this move is, extrapolation of. I can maybe kind of for example, you have a pump handle slam, right? Where you're you go underneath, their back. You reach down under their crotch, you take their arm, then, you lift them up through that way, and you put your arm over their shoulder, you lift them up, you slam them down in different ways. There's different names for different moves. But then you have that exact same move, but then you have, for example, Shingo Takagi does the Made in Japan, where then he flips you over from that way, he slams you down, right? It's very, very graceful move, but, for people, if you don't know that name, the reference Made in Japan, you could say, oh, well, that's a pump handle, that's a pump power slam or something, or a pump handle Falcon Arrow or something. It's you can extrapolate, if I'm making sense. So, for example, if you have a heuristic over one set of knowledge, if you have, say, a knowledge of wind turbines, and you know exactly how a motor in a boat works, right? But it's also a turbine type of engine. It's you can maybe logically extrapolate the mechanisms that determine that, sequence of events that happens within an engine. The power sources are much different, but The point being is that you can sort of kind of fit the verbiage or those positions in your head together. And from there, you can sort of kind of convince people that you know what you're talking about. Byung Chul is saying, no, this is not the truth. The reality is that it goes beyond that. It's not just BS. It's the facts themselves are up for debate in such a fundamental way because there are rival narratives that sort of sound similar and sort of also sound, they're different, but they also have similar bases of their ability to have warranted true belief about something, about the facts of a material reality on the ground. That's the whole point. The actual reality is up for debate. So anyways, moving on. So in the past 2 years, you could see this, right? Information changed all the time. The experts would contradict themselves. They have equal qualifications. So it's who do you believe? It's really a toss-up. It's what your attitudinal disposition is. It's what your political beliefs are. Those really informed everything. Your position on the sacrament is I can probably guess your position on other things. So it's when Trudeau said, they're probably sexist and transphobic and racist and blah, blah, blah. They hate women. It's you can pretty much guess. Not that they're everyone who didn't take the sacrament is a racist, homophobe, blah, blah, blah. But it's you can guess the disposition of having based world politics and, not taking, the sacrament. But yeah, anyways, moving on. So, the crisis of truth shakes beliefs in the facts themselves. The erosion of truth began long before Trump's politics of fake news. In 2005, the New York Times declared the negligism truthiness. Oh, God, no. Oh, I hate Stephen Colbert so much. I hate him so much. But anyways, let's move on. to be one of the words that have captured the zeitgeist. I remember the whole truthiness thing. Oh, it was terrible. Truthiness reflects the crisis of truth. It means a felt truth that lacks any objectivity or factual solidarity. So I guess maybe Colbert predicted the gamer head, yes, predicted Giga Chad, dialogues, you know. It means a felt truth that lacks any objective factual solidarity. It's subjective willfulness, which is, in essence, elements or eliminates the truth. This willfulness expresses the nihilistic attitude towards reality. It is a pathological phenomenon of digitalization. Remember, it's 2005. 2003 was the, really the epoch of like normies going on the internet. 2005 was the eternal summer that never ended. It was the eternal September. Anyways, going on. It's subjective willfulness, which is, in essence, eliminates the truth. It is pathological phenomenon of digitalization. It does not belong to the book culture. The digital, in particular, erodes the factual. The television presenter Stephen Colbert, who coined the term truthiness, once remarked, quote, I don't trust books. They're all facts, no heart. Yeah, but I'm sure he was doing that spoofing like, conservatives and they're dumb and reality has a liberal bias. Yeah, okay. You know what's so funny? Let me do a little rant about that. You know what's so funny about the reality has a liberal bias thing? You know what's so funny about that? Is that he's right in the sense that when you have the ability to manufacture reality, then you can say that it has a liberal bias. You can say that, well, I guess all these experts are right. You know why they're right? You know why the libs think they're right all the time? Because, okay, they're probably consuming news that just, is confirmation bias. We all do this. We all have our echo chamber goon caves, right? Or hug boxes. But also it's because when you have the ability to sort of cajole and influence things at such a high degree of power, then you can replicate the conditions that make it seem like your side is always on the side of truth. On the sort of grand scale of, well, the right side of history. It's really just like the, Hegelian world spirit is on the side of the libs. It's like, no, that's not the case. It's that you've conveniently ignored things on the ground that don't conform to that picture of reality. But also you've made verboten every other view besides the consensus liberal one. You've demonized all the other, rival ideologies, all the other rival facts even on the ground. You are just as much a product of that truthiness as trying to spoof, the contards into thinking that, oh, well, they're just bumpkins. They believe, it doesn't have any feeling. In other words, they when like boomer libs, they take like outdated lingo from years ago and they're like, facts don't care about your feelings or you're a snowflake. It's like the lib saying, snowflake. We've moved on. The point being is that they have the ability to say that, but when Stephen Colbert said truthiness, he meant like conservatives that like, oh, they're really like conservatives are the actual, facts don't care about their feelings people. You know what I mean? It's like they're kind of like taking like our, the conservative equivalent of Dems are the real racists, like libs are the real racists. And they're like, no, actually, conservatives are the real, facts don't care about your feelings, right? But really, feelings don't really care about your facts, right? Like it goes both ways. So that's truthiness. They're just as much a product of that. It's just that they can't concede the fact that they've largely captured those institutions and abilities to manufacture consent when it comes to people's common beliefs about things. But anyways, moving on. So, there are facts, no heart. But again, Stephen Colbert was being facetious and sardonic and saying they only care about feelings, man. But really, it's the truth. It's like the facts are facts. They don't have any heart. But really, the heart, feeling, hyperstition, those eventually manufacture reality in our post-truth, hyperstitional, hyper-reality era, epoch. Feelings just have a way of making themselves revealed to the real in a way that we haven't seen before. It would take generations of propaganda by the, to make people believe something that was wrong or not exactly the truth. Now it just takes a matter of minutes, right? So there you go. There you go. Anyways, moving on. Trump, accordingly, would be a president of the heart. Exactly, he was. Our sentiments, our feelings that may not be true now, but they will be true eventually. If we just post hard enough, our truth will manifest itself, the clearing of truth in the digital age that the frogs discovered, that process of hyperstition, that meme magic. It all relates back to it. President of the heart who makes little use of understanding. The heart is not an organ of democracy. Giga chat, yes, this is where Byung Chul is, maybe in some ways condemning it, but really I would say that it's an affirmation. Is that feelings, meme magic, hyperstition will undermine your placid your flaccid view of democracy. There's no bearing on this world anymore. That's great. That's amazing. Clear the way. Burn it all down. Start again. Anyways, I know I'm being a bit extreme, but anyways. When emotions and affects dominate political discourse, democracy itself is in danger. Oh no! In her Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt writes, how am I going to say this? The painter of Austrians, the Austrian painter, circulated millions of copies of his book in which he stated that it is to be successful, a lie must be so enormous that it must not be limited to a denial of individual facts within a factual context that remains intact. In which case, the context will always eventually show the lie for what they are. But most replaced the whole factual edifice, so the false facts of individual lies from a consistent context and put in a factual world in place of the real one. This is how you manufacture consent. The libs have been doing this, right? You realize that. They've taken the engines of consensus making. And, okay, you have, the point that Arendt makes is that you have an individual lie, but the overall truth is still affirmed. Because you're just messing with that one aspect of it by creating an individual lie. What the painter of Austrian says, you have to have, a whole... I don't believe he actually said that. There's people that, there are people who are sympathetic to the Austrian painter that have come up with scholarship that says that he actually didn't say this. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. Let's pretend that Arendt's scholarship is not biased by her own, predisposition. But let's pretend that she's an unbiased source, even though she isn't. But let's claim that, he actually said it, whatever. The point being is that it's not that you're lying, it's that your picture window view of reality. Like an artist creating a picture. Like the Austrian painter painting landscapes. That turns into politics, right? That is installing your version of reality with the rival ideological picture of that same reality. And he had the might and political will to do it, right? If you have enough political will, if you have enough agency to do it, like the libs have currently, then you can basically create that painting of reality. Because you've changed the meta, you've changed the images of thought. Images of thought being those things that go beyond thinking. Those things that inform how you think. If you change the conditions of how people think, then your reality will be manufactured seamlessly. It will just become a logical conclusion because people believe the parameters by which you are thinking to begin with. This is how the libs have tricked us. They've said that they are the natural conclusion of history because they've also manufactured how you think about history in general. How you think about the development of civilization. They have manufactured that. They have given you their ideological picture because they pretended that they don't have an ideology. So libs like Stephen Colbert have tricked themselves up in that dialectic. You have to go beyond merely telling lies about politics. Or telling, not lies, but rather telling your own perspective as truth. When you govern the matrix by which people make those assumptions about what is truth, what is politics, what is cultural truth, what is right and proper moralism. When you've manufactured the things beyond those, how you even inform those moralistic or political or cultural thoughts, then your quote-unquote lies, which aren't really lies, they're rather just rival pictures of the real, then they become the natural conclusions of things. Anyways, moving on. So, according to Arendt, the Austrian painter was not a conventional liar. He was capable of a kind of lie whose enormity and totality produced a new reality. I hope he's not going with this, like, oh, Donald Trump is like the Austrian painter. But anyways, we'll see where he goes with this. Someone who invents a new reality does not lie in the conventional sense. The relationship between ideology and truth is, however, far more complex than Arendt assumes. The Austrian painter, too, had a firm commitment to truth. He continued to regard truth as an authority. He spread his, racist ideology in the name of truth. He always presents his propaganda in the light of truth. There are truths, the Austrian painter wrote, that are so obvious that just for this reason the common world does not see, or at least does not recognize them. The world passes those well-known truisms blindly and is the most astonished if now someone discovers what everybody ought to know. Truth is one of the concepts frequently used by the Austrian painter in his book, his struggle. There are, quote, guardians of higher truth, and there is talk of eternal truth. He distances himself from the promoters of lies and calumnies, that presents himself as a herald of truth. Those people, in particular, are defamed by him as the great master of lying and accused of living a lie. Their entire essence is built on one single great lie. Moving on, not commenting on it. The truth also retains its position of authority in Orwellian totalitarian surveillance state, which is erected on a monumental lie that presents itself as the truth. Winston Smith, the protagonist, says, if all others accept the lie which the party imposes, if all records told the same tale, then the lie is passed into history and becomes truth. Well, this is very true. I mean, barring the ideological quibblings of the Austrian painter and the liberals or whatever, this is true. This is how a truth is taken up commonly by, not exactly, the real truth, but whatever. The point being is that this is the process of it. Without moralizing it, this is the process of it. The party lies, but such in the enormity of the lie, it turns into truth. The party continues to make use of the authority of truth. The Ministry of Truth plays a central role in Orwell's dystopian world. It is an enormous pyramid structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. The building dominates the cityscape. It is with news, entertainment, and education, and fine arts, all these together. I think the libs have discovered this. They have a more powerful Ministry of Truth than anyone. But anyways, you know all you people know all this, right? Theaters and books. It produces low-quality papers filled with crime and sports, cheap sensationalist novels, and sentimental pop songs. Right? I mean, it's everywhere. It's to the point where even mass entertainment and pop culture is garbage. Because it's not because it's ideological. You need things that are ideological to function as a society. But people that say, just leave my video games alone, just leave my movies, my comic books, my Lord of the Rings alone, right? It's like it's ideology that poisons it. No, it's the cringe ideology that poisons it. Just admit it. That's sort of kind of like anti-SJW, like, early Sargon of Akkad. Sargon of Akkad has even advanced beyond that, like, alt-right type of stuff. That's sort of like anti-SJW, like, just leave us alone, man. That doesn't cut it nowadays. But anyways, moving on. The point being is that they, our enemies, the libs, they know this. They know this more than anyone. But anyways, Its aim is to prevent independent thought among the population. The Ministry of Truth even has a whole subdivision dedicated to the mass production of pornography. Porn is used as a means of domination. Someone who is addicted to porn or gaming will not revolt against the rulers. Well, I mean, gamers certainly revolt against the rulers, but gaming, Gamergate really was the ground zero. But before we move on, and maybe we'll take a little break, I think that I wanted to comment on the nature of what the right wing and the left wing means by truth, right? Now, there's different levels to it. And I think this really is an observation that I've had for many years now, ever since I was a kid. Not a kid, but, a teenager. I used to, weigh the comments on discus comment sections, on, how many conservative commenters there were that got upvotes, how many libs. And I remember thinking about, these, leftoid debate bros, Destiny, or, even, Vouch or whatever. I think what really divides when it comes down to the issue of truth between, the leftoid and, the right-winger is precisely this aim at trans-historical truth, at eternal values. So let me explain really quickly. This is something I've observed for many years now. But I say really quickly, it's not going to take... It'll take longer than, being really quick. But anyways, I've noticed that the ideological breakdown between the left and right can always be segmented into different quatrains of, let's say, analytic or romanticist. That the leftoids, they have just as much of a, not just as much of a diversity, they have very small diversity of their opinion, but I feel that nowadays it's sort of complicated. There was a moment, I think, from the late 90s to maybe early to mid 2000s, where you could say that the leftoid, up until the 2010s, was going in more of an analytical or rationalist or calculative direction. The culmination being the post New Atheist on YouTube debate bro, the Destinies and Vouches of the world, that they have a very I would say nihilistic. I mean, these people are the creatures of the neoliberal order. They don't have any, especially Destiny, they really don't have any solid beliefs. But I think that the debate bro is interesting because they are thoroughly secular, thoroughly materialistic. They are blind to the fact that, the science and data and so forth is being manipulated, or at least suffering from replication bias, suffering from, the various ways that academics cook the books, but also their root beliefs are grounded in the consensus machine of the current liberal order. But apart from that, their sort of materialism is in stark contrast in some ways to the more wokeified, various intersectional bi-POC, blah, 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 you name it, bi-POC, LGBT plus, QII, blah, 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 that version of the contemporary leftist, they embody more of the romanticist side of it, for lack of a better term. But they also will default to a sort of tactical nihilism that relies upon materialistic assumptions about the human, especially when it comes to sexuality. Well, is it hurting you? Why does it bother you? Every time you have a tweet that blows up from some wannabe trad girl about modesty, you'll always have especially by POC Twitter, they really have been programmed to become, serfs of the reigning ideology, which is really funny because you'd figure that the embrace, from a post-colonial framework, the embrace of identity and, mysticism of various global southern, global south, and global east belief systems, they're really just boiled down into identity issues. But it's funny how they do inhabit lingering mystical or metaphysical ways of thinking. But it is quite interesting to see how they will default to a tactical nihilism, which relies upon this, like, really, like, turd brain type of, reductionism of, well, when you really think about it, it doesn't really affect you. Ayala posting about how her soul felt cleansed by getting, never mind. It's like, yeah, that type of rationalistic thinking when it comes to human behavior and behavioral freedom, that is where they will employ the more analytic-minded debate bro version of leftism, which in a lot of ways comes out of the more progressive quatrains of the new atheist movement in the 2000s. So the right has this too. The right is very obvious, though. It's the sort of our acceleration, futurism, and human biodiversity, that type of right-wing thinking, evo psych, some manosphere stuff, but mostly like you have to have a very high IQ to be a racist, but oh god, that's terrible. But not really. Anyways, it's funny because that's sort of the one aspect of the right wing. You could say like Nietzschean